Today's story took place in the quiet town of Derry, New Hampshire in 1990, a place where young families were building their lives together and violent crime seemed like something that happened somewhere else. But behind closed doors, one household was harboring secrets that would soon explode into one of the most shocking murder cases in American history. Pamela Wojcicki was born in August 1967 in Coral Gables, Florida, to a well-to-do family. Her father worked as an airline pilot, her mother as a part-time legal secretary. When Pamela reached 8th grade, she and her family relocated to New Hampshire, where Pamela grew up attending high school. From an early age, she was ambitious and loved being the center of attention. In high school, she was a cheerleader, popular among her peers and well-liked for her sense of humor and outgoing personality. After graduating, Pamela went on to study at Florida State University, where she dreamed of becoming a news anchor or working in the media industry. While in college, she worked at the campus radio station, hosting her own show called Metal Madness. She was known as the Maiden of Metal, a nickname that reflected her love for heavy metal music and her vibrant personality. During the winter break of 1986, Pamela returned home for the holidays, a familiar routine filled with family traditions and reunions with old friends. On New Year's Eve, she attended a party with friends, and it was there that she met Gregory Smart. They hit it off almost instantly, bonding over their shared love of heavy metal music. Greg was charmed by her confidence and energy. Pamela, in turn, was taken by his relaxed nature and the way he seemed genuinely interested in her. When it was time for Pamela to head back to Florida State, Greg didn't stay behind. He followed her south, not to enroll or pursue a degree, but simply because he couldn't imagine being apart. Their connection had moved quickly, but it felt real to both of them. By the time Pamela finished school, they had already made a decision. They were going to build a life together. After graduation, they moved back to New Hampshire and settled in Derry, choosing a quiet, upscale neighborhood where they could start fresh as husband and wife. The newlyweds seemed to have everything going for them. Pamela and Greg settled into a well-kept home just a block from Greg's parents, the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their porches and children played in the yard. They adopted a dog, adding to the picture of a young couple building their future. Greg took a job in insurance, a steady, respectable position, but it came with trade-offs. He cut his long hair, traded in his metal t-shirts for button-downs, and began dressing the part of a professional. To Pamela, the change was strange. She was disappointed to see her metal-loving husband transform into what she considered a boring businessman. As Greg settled into his new professional role, the honeymoon phase began to fade. Their relationship began to face its first serious challenge. The couple's problems deepened when Greg confessed to Pamela that he had been unfaithful. This revelation devastated her and marked the beginning of serious trouble in their marriage. However, despite the marital difficulties, Pamela was building her own career. She landed a job at Winnacunnet High School in Hampton, where she worked as a media services coordinator, creating videos and managing audiovisual equipment. She also volunteered with a drug prevention organization called Project Self-Esteem, working with teenagers to help them make better life choices. At just 22, Pamela could easily relate to the students, and they loved her for it. She was fun, funny, and easy to talk to. The students saw her as someone who understood them, someone who was different from the typical adults in their lives. Among all the students who were drawn to her, one stood out in particular, a 15-year-old named William Flynn, who went by Billy. At first, he only came around during volunteer sessions. Then he started showing up between classes. Eventually, he was in her office almost every day. He was always hanging around, always ready to help. Pamela didn't seem to mind. Billy had that rebellious charm, the shoulder-length hair, the earring, the leather jacket. He played guitar. He loved heavy metal. In a lot of ways, he reminded her of Greg, or at least the version of Greg she used to love. Pamela knew how Billy felt about her. It wasn't subtle. Most people in the building could see it. But instead of creating distance, she let it continue. After Greg's betrayal, her confidence had taken a hit. She was still young, still figuring things out, and Billy's attention felt good. He looked at her like she was everything. She began to feed into his feelings, giving him the attention and encouragement he craved. Pamela also became close friends with another student, Cecilia Pierce, who served as her teen assistant. Pamela shared everything with Cecilia, treating her like a confidant rather than just a student. She shared things most adults wouldn't share with a teenager. Unfortunately for Pamela, this closeness would later prove to be a critical mistake. In early 1990, the relationship between Pamela and Billy crossed a line when they shared their first kiss. What had been an inappropriate flirtation between a teacher and student had now become something much more serious and potentially dangerous. The situation escalated in late March 1990, when Greg was out of town on a business trip. Pamela decided to invite Billy and Cecilia over to her house to hang out and watch movies. But at one point, Cecilia stepped out to walk the dog, and with the house quiet, Pamela and Billy went upstairs to her bedroom, where they had sexual relations for the first time. This marked the beginning of a secret affair that would continue for several weeks. But there was one major obstacle standing in the way of their relationship: Greg. Billy had strong feelings for Pamela and wanted to be with her openly, but as long as she was married, their relationship would have to remain hidden. The tension in this impossible situation was building toward a breaking point, and that breaking point came on May 1st, 1990, a Tuesday that would change everything. That morning, Greg left for work at 9:45 a.m., just as he did every weekday. A few minutes later, Pamela left for her job at the high school. She had several meetings scheduled that day and wouldn't be returning home until late that evening. However, when Pamela arrived home at 10 p.m., she immediately noticed something was wrong. The house was dark, which was unusual because Greg always turned on the porch light when he knew she would be coming home late. His car was in the driveway, so she knew he was home, but the house remained dark and quiet. When she entered the house, she found Greg lying on the floor. She ran out, screaming for help, banging on neighbors' doors in a panic. The neighbors, alarmed by Pamela's frantic screams, quickly called 911, reporting that there was someone unconscious in the house and that a woman was in a state of panic. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. Greg was already gone. Soon after, police officers arrived and began their investigation. At first, it looked like a possible burglary gone wrong. But as they moved through the scene, certain details stood out. It didn't feel random. There were no signs of forced entry into the house. Greg's wedding ring, which had diamonds, was still on his finger. His wallet, containing money, was still in his possession. Most importantly, Greg had been executed with a single gunshot to the head at close range. This was not the work of a panicked burglar, but rather a calculated killing. As a standard procedure in such cases, investigators immediately began looking closely at the person closest to the victim, Pamela Smart. However, she had a solid alibi for the time of the murder. She had been at school meetings and could account for her whereabouts throughout the evening. The investigation expanded to include Greg's friends and family, but no obvious suspects emerged. Greg was well-liked and had no known enemies. He was a young man starting his career and building a life with his wife. There seemed to be no motive for anyone to want him dead. However, 2 weeks after the murder, the father of one of Billy Flynn's close friends, Vance Lattime Sr., came to the police with a gun. He explained that he had lent the weapon to someone a few weeks earlier, but when it was returned to him, he noticed it had been cleaned. Since he hadn't cleaned it himself, he became suspicious that it might have been used in a crime. Ballistics testing confirmed that this was indeed the murder weapon. The gun that killed Greg Smart had been in the possession of teenagers, which immediately shifted the focus of the investigation toward a younger demographic. Around that same time, police received an anonymous tip. Someone claimed that a student named Cecilia Pierce knew more than she was letting on. According to the caller, the murder hadn't been random at all. It had been planned, and Pamela Smart was the one behind it. That tip, along with the teenage connection to the murder weapon, began to reveal a very different picture of what might have happened that night. Investigators noticed something unusual about Pamela's behavior in the weeks following her husband's death. She seemed remarkably composed and unemotional for someone who had just lost her husband in such a violent way. When police took her to the crime scene, she walked across the blood-stained carpet without any show of emotion, something that struck officers as odd. Police began interviewing the teenagers connected to the case: Billy Flynn, Pete Randall, Vance Lattime Jr., and Cecilia Pierce. Initially, none of them said much, but Cecilia was more cooperative than the others. Investigators asked if she'd be willing to wear a wire, and she agreed, willing to help record conversations between her and Pamela. The recorded conversations between Cecilia and Pamela would prove to be crucial evidence in the case. In these recordings, made at the high school where Pamela worked, Conversations took place that would later be used to demonstrate Pamela's involvement in planning her husband's murder. On August 1, 1990, Pamela was sitting in her office at work when detectives walked in. They told her they had solved Greg's murder, and that she was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. By this time, the local media had been following the story since the beginning, but now national attention turned toward the case. The story had everything that captures public fascination: sex, murder, teenagers, and a beautiful young woman at the center of it all. The case became a media phenomenon, with people lining up for hours just to get a seat in the courtroom during the trial. When the trial began in March 1991, the prosecution laid out their theory of what had really happened. According to their case, Pamela had manipulated Billy Flynn into killing her husband so that she could be with her teenage lover and collect on Greg's life insurance policy. The key witnesses were the teenagers themselves: Billy Flynn, Pete Randall, Junior Lattime, and Cecilia Pierce. Each of them took the stand and testified about their role in the events leading up to Greg's murder. Billy Flynn testified that Pamela had asked him to kill Greg, explaining that she was afraid of losing everything in a divorce. She had told him that Greg had been physically abusive and that she was trapped in the marriage. According to Billy, Pamela had said that if they divorced, she would lose the house, all of their possessions, and even their dog, which she claimed would devastate her. Billy admitted that he had initially been reluctant to go through with the murder. On 2 separate occasions, he had gotten nervous and backed out of the plan. But each time, Pamela grew angrier. According to him, she threatened to break off their relationship if he didn't go through with it. Eventually, Billy agreed to the plan and recruited his 2 best friends, Pete Randall and Junior Lattime, to help him. The 3 boys discussed the murder plot, working out the details of how they would carry it out. The plan was for the boys to dress in black and enter the house through a side door that Pamela would leave unlocked for them, stage a fake burglary, and make it look like a random crime. In addition to keeping whatever they stole, Pamela had promised to pay each of them $500 from Greg's $140,000 life insurance policy. On the day of the murder, both Pamela and the boys went to school and work as usual, trying to maintain normal routines. However, the prosecution claimed that Pamela had dressed unusually that day, wearing every piece of jewelry she owned because she was afraid the boys might steal it when they came to kill her husband. The prosecution also pointed out that Pamela had specifically told Billy not to kill Greg in front of their dog because it would traumatize the dog. This detail suggested a level of planning and consideration that contradicted any claim that the murder was spontaneous or unplanned. On the evening of May 1st, while Pamela was at her school meetings, Billy Flynn and Pete Randall entered the smart home through the unlocked side door. Junior Lattime and another friend waited in the car outside. Once inside, Billy and Pete messed up the house to make it look like a burglary and then waited for Greg to come home from work. When Greg arrived, the 2 teenagers overpowered him. At first, Pete had grabbed a knife from the kitchen, intending to stab Greg, but ultimately they decided to use the gun instead. Greg, thinking he was dealing with burglars, handed over his wallet without resistance. However, when they demanded his wedding ring, he refused, saying, "I can't, my wife will kill me." This statement would later take on a tragic irony, as it was indeed his wife who had arranged for his death. Billy Flynn then shot Greg Smart in the head at close range, killing him instantly. The defense argued that while Pamela had indeed had an affair with Billy Flynn, she had tried to end the relationship when she realized how inappropriate it was. According to the defense, Billy had become obsessed with Pamela and had killed Greg on his own initiative, hoping that with her husband out of the way, she would be free to be with him. Pamela herself took the stand in her own defense, admitting to the affair but denying any involvement in planning her husband's murder. She claimed that she had no idea why Billy had killed Greg and suggested that he had done it because he thought they could be together afterward. However, the prosecution's case was strong. They had the recorded conversations between Pamela and Cecilia, testimony from multiple witnesses, and physical evidence linking the teenagers to the crime. Most damaging of all, they had Billy Flynn's own confession and his detailed account of how Pamela had manipulated him into committing murder. After 13 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Pamela Smart was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and was immediately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case generated significant controversy, both during and after the trial. Some questioned whether the teenager's testimony was reliable, given that they had been offered plea deals in exchange for their cooperation. There were also concerns about the media coverage and whether Pamela had received a fair trial given the intense public interest in the case. The teenagers involved received various sentences. Billy Flynn, who actually pulled the trigger, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 12 years. Pete Randall received the same sentence. Junior Lattime, who had provided the murder weapon and served as the getaway driver, was sentenced to life as an accomplice to second-degree murder, eligible for parole after 30 years with 12 years suspended. Cecilia Pierce, despite her role in the conspiracy, was not charged with any crime because she had cooperated with police and helped them solve the case. She later sold the rights to her story to a film production company for $100,000. The case raised questions about the power dynamics between adults and teenagers, the role of the media in high-profile trials, and the nature of manipulation and coercion. Some people believe that Pamela had indeed manipulated a vulnerable teenager into committing murder, while others felt that she had been unfairly demonized and that the Real killers had received lighter sentences than she had. Over the years, there have been various attempts to appeal Pamela's conviction and sentence. Some have pointed to inconsistencies in the evidence, such as the fact that Billy Flynn was left-handed, but ballistics evidence suggested the shooter was right-handed. Others have questioned the credibility of the teenage witnesses, noting that they had time to coordinate their stories while housed together before the trial. In 1996, she was severely beaten by 2 other prisoners and had to be hospitalized with injuries so serious that a metal plate had to be inserted into her face. Since then, she has been on pain medication and has faced various other challenges in the prison system. Throughout her incarceration, Pamela has maintained her innocence. She has never admitted to having any role in planning her husband's murder, though she has acknowledged the affair with Billy Flynn and expressed regret for that relationship. She has spent her time in prison volunteering and participating in various support groups, earning numerous achievements and certifications. Meanwhile, the teenagers who actually carried out the murder have all been released from prison. Billy Flynn, who confessed to pulling the trigger, was granted parole and has publicly apologized to Greg Smart's family for his actions. Thank you for watching. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Stay safe and take care of each other.